So a buddy of mine told me about zero-based budgeting and how it was used at Tesla. And when I asked him about a budget for a project, and initially I was thinking, this is dumb. Like, you need constraints to run a project. And my thinking when he first told me about it was that you start with zero and you just spend however much it costs. After rethinking a little bit and doing a little bit of research on it, I realized that there's some real advantages, and I've changed my mind on zero-based budgeting. And so there are a couple of advantages, and I have some notes here. So starting projects faster depends on where the budgeting talent is. Who is going to do the budget? So there's an advantage. One of the advantages is that if you're a company and you have leadership and then you have like a project manager, leadership says, hey, we want to start this thing, and we don't want to assume that what it costs to do a project before is the same as what's going to cost right now. Furthermore, this leadership person doesn't necessarily want to build the budget or know how to build the budget. And so it can take a really long time, and he's going to become more of a bottleneck if he holds on to it too long. And so probably the best thing to do in an organization like that, or an organization that's serious about scaling, is going to be push that work down, because that's how you scale. You push work down. You don't scale by holding on to work. That's how you become a bottleneck. You get stressed out, and you never build the talent underneath you to be able to catch a lot of these things that you want to throw at them, because you're not throwing anything. So these are some of the advantages. Initially, I was thinking, well, it takes away speed, right? Zero-based budgeting takes away speed, because now you have to create the budget before you start. Well, guess what else it does? It helps you diagnose. And so if you're a leader and you're like, hey, I want to know, can this project manager be a product manager and eventually a leader in the organization? One way to tell is you throw a scope and a timeline at them, and then you see if they can execute on it. You see if they have the understanding to be able to create that budget, or you want to find out where their baseline is, and then you want to make them better at it, better at creating their own budget, their own zero-based budget. Okay, so let me talk about what zero-based budgeting is, really. Zero-based budgeting is saying, we're not going to say, oh, it cost this much last time to do it, therefore it'll cost this much this time. It's not taking a number from somewhere else and just slapping it on the project. It's saying, let's look at the deliverables. Let's build the deliverables out, and let's find out what the steps are to create the project. And then we'll take those hours and resources, and then we'll say, okay, well, let's put a budget on it. And then you put a budget on it based on what you need to do, not based on what you think has been done before. And so what that would look like is the contrast would be, oh, we've always created a budget. We've always like, oh, it's probably going to cost like this much to get this thing done. So you have a department and you have an annual budget for your department. With zero-based budgeting, you create the budget again every year from scratch. You're not saying, well, we'll take last year and then we need to do these things different, so we're going to adjust it. But mostly it's based on last year's budget. You're not basing it on last year's budget. You're basing it on what you need to accomplish this year. And so what you would do then is you wouldn't, and this was what I thought at first. Here's a myth about zero-based budgeting. What I thought at first was that when he first said that, I thought, oh, so we just start the project and spend as much money as we need. Where's the discipline in that? Where is the creativity? How are we saving money doing that when I know as a project manager, I can just ask for more money and I'll get it? What zero-based budgeting is, I think, properly done, is that you as a project manager, you get handed a scope and a timeline, and you're asked to create a budget and then send that back up for approval. So I think that's what zero-based budgeting is. And when I was talking with my friend, it appears that they did not have that budget yet. So they're still at the beginning of the project. And so what needs to happen is we need to start scoping it. We need to start, scoping it according to the timeline and then estimating it based. If leadership has to create the budget, then things take longer to get off the ground because it has to happen in leadership. And a lot of time leadership is very busy. And so it actually helps the organization move more quickly if you hand that down and say, hey, can you unblank the page for me on this? And that's what I found too, as being one of the most important things for moving fast, is being able to say, for a leader to be able to hand something off and then say, hey, I have this vague idea. And then someone who can understand that idea then turns around and says, okay, let me mock it up real quick. Is this the idea that you're thinking about? And they either say yes, no, make alterations or whatever, but now the burden is on, you've pushed work down. Now you have someone you can trust to understand the idea and then build something out. Probably the way I would want to do it, I think the smartest way to do it, I found so far, is that the smartest way to push that work down. And that's for the CEO or the visionary to be able to have a number two in command, like in EOS, that's called an integrator. But that person has the ability to understand vision, and not every integrator can understand vision. Some integrators are like, let's just get costs under control, right? which is good if that's what you need. But the kind of a development integrator is going to be someone who can take that vision and then say, okay, here's the process. Let me first spend a few minutes with you and understand your idea and hear your vision. I just want to listen for a little bit. I'm going to take notes or whatever. Then I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to go and I'm going to spend like a half an hour unblanking the page, just saying, hey, here's how many hours I think it'll take. Here's how much it's going to cost. Here's the timeline, based on like these 3 big deliverables. So far, does it make sense? And they're like, yeah, that makes sense. And my cost estimate might be a little bit over, maybe. I don't know. But I'm unblanking the page. I've given them something to react to before I go off and spend 10 hours or whatever trying to perfect this vision that I don't even understand yet, or I don't know that I understand. So I take that to them. And then maybe it's like, maybe it's just the iron triangle of project management. Maybe it's just scope, timeline, budget, right? And I'm just like throwing that out. I think it'll cost this much. Is that crazy? And then he's like, no, that's not crazy. That's about right. Change this, this, and this, and we're good. And then I take that and I say, okay, well then let me build that out just another level and then bring it back to him. I'm way more complete. And then say, hey, is this what it looks like? And he's like, yep. And so the more unknowns, the more iterations of that process. So the more vague and so for example, I may get to that second level, that second big deliverable and say, there's still a bunch of gray areas that I have. And I want to know, I have like these 5 questions that I need to ask before I do this, edit this one more time before I bring it to project management. There are some things that are relatively simple and maybe I've done it before or something analogous before, and I can kind of build it out and then hand it off to project management. A lot of times I run into a question I didn't anticipate, so I have to ask that question again. So you may have a few iterations in that process, but what you're not doing is you're not leaving the burden on the CEO and you're not spending tons of man hours on things that you don't even know yet. And I think that's what gets people is that a CEO will ask them for something and they don't know how to do it. And so they're either stressed out or they just look at something that's been done before and try to pass that off. But what a development integrator needs to do is to be able to say, okay, well, let's take this top down. Let's make sure we know why you want to do this. And then let's make sure it's practical at a high level. We'll just test it at a high level, back of the napkin, make sure it kind of works. And then if everything checks out, then we move down. That's a very logical way to do it. And it works just fine with zero-based budgeting, as I understand it. Because what you're doing is it's not a violation of zero-based budgeting, as I understand it, to affix an estimated price at the very beginning to say, hey, I think it's probably going to take about this much. Because once it gets down to a certain level and you've built it out a little bit, there's some detail to it. Now a project manager is going to be able to say, okay, let's take each one of these small things. We have enough detail. I know the tasks and deliverables. And so let's take that and let's turn that into some pricing. How long will it take? So now it's going to be a lot easier to estimate the smaller things like, oh, we need to create this report. Okay, that's going to take 10 hours, right? But if you put it all together and try to estimate it all together, then you have a lot less resolution, a lot less fine-tuned, high-res view of what the pricing needs to be. And so I think that's one of the benefits. There are other benefits too. Budget tied to what it's worth to us, not just what does it cost. So a lot of times pricing is based on how much is it worth to us. And initially I was thinking, well, we don't know. We don't have any information on pricing at the beginning because we do zero-based budgeting, which means we have no information about pricing. That's not true. So I think that this lends itself still to what is it worth to us? It's not starting with that assumption. It's not saying, what is this worth to us? $1 million? Well, then let's be willing to spend $750,000. Yeah, but what if it just costs like $100,000? That can be the wrong way to look at it. Using what is it worth to us is very important because it tells you whether it's worth doing or not. Finance people can nerd out about that. They can compare net present values of different projects based on assumptions, based on what they think they know. And that's good. It tests project managers and product managers. Do they understand the product or the process enough? You do have to understand the process of deliverables in order to know how to scope it with zero-based pricing, because you have to do it from scratch. And that's what a lot of people have trouble doing. I think it's useful for startups and innovative companies because it does help things move faster, and they need to move fast. And it helps develop people and involve them in the project, because if you don't tell them pricing, they now have to use everything else. It's kind of like, how if you lose one of your senses, then the other one's magnified, they say. So someone who is blind, their hearing is so much better because they rely on it. Well, if you don't give them pricing, now you have to understand scope better. You have to understand timeline better. And then you probably have to understand the vision better, which is kind of part of the scope, right? Like, why are we doing this? Why is it valuable? People could spend hours budgeting only to be super far off. you can hand something down and they can spend like 10, 20 hours trying to budget this out and do all the research and everything and bring it back to you. And either they're unskilled at it and they're way off, or it's just like the budget ends up being way off. Like this is not even worth doing, right? But again, that goes back to the idea I talked about earlier about having that stepwise process where the visionary has an idea for something and a timeline. And then you're like, okay, well then if we have to make all these things at a high level, then here's about what it'll probably cost to do. And that could be a total of like, let's see, you have a meeting with your CEO, 2 people. So that's 2 man hours. You have that anyway, right? And then maybe another like hour of like, hey, here's, half an hour of just kind of like writing it out on paper and just figuring out the high level things and then handing that back to the CEO. And he's like, yeah, that's still in line. Let's move to the next step. Or, that's way out. The budget's too much. Let's just kill it right now or put it on the back burner. We'll do it later. And so people may spend hours budgeting only to be way off, costing way more. Now, if you were a CEO and you're handing off like, hey, here's what I want, and then here's the budget I can spend. Now you've already done that work. And so there's less of a risk of someone running off and spending a bunch of hours and having it be way off, right? So there are trade-offs. Can slow things down if management is incompetent. So this process, zero-based budgeting, is fast only if the right talent is in place. And so if the CEO is constantly throwing down ideas, too many ideas that are too off base and too expensive, then you have to think about it. Again, this is why it's a diagnostic tool. Is it because project management's not very good at estimating? Or is it because the CEO is just not very good at coming up with realistic ideas that can possibly work? There are a lot of people with ideas that are just crazy and untethered from reality. Creates different kinds of employees. Yeah. So I think, especially in startups, and this is important, a small startup, you want people to grow. You want to trust people. You want your team to be proactive. And so a lot of times what you end up having is, you might have 2 cultures, 2 extremes, and most people are in the middle, but 2 extremes where you have like kind of a more militaristic Prussian kind of, hey, I'm going to ask you for a budget and I want you to give me a freaking budget, right? That's ready to kick off the project. Kind of impatient. I need to get this done. Do it for me. Spend the hours. I don't think these people are always thinking about how many hours it'll take to do that, but they just want it done, right? The worst ones of these will, when you come back and they find out how many hours you spent building it, they freak out, right? That's one way to do things. There's also a good way to do it where it's just like, hey, I just need it, and I'm not going to be mad at you. I know how many hours it takes to do this. I'm not going to be frustrated, but I do need a detailed budget. And so the project manager has to make up everything. He has to answer all the questions, all the uncertainties to get to that budget. So any vagueness. So basically you need project managers with a ton of experience doing that thing, or you need to be able to tolerate people who are making a lot of assumptions for you. The other kind is you might have someone, an organization where the CEO is like, hey, here's the idea. And then I need a budget for this that's ready for projects. And then, but that project manager or product manager or whoever it is may say like, okay, here's a budget and here are a bunch of assumptions tied up in this budget. And I can go through them all if you want. It'll take a lot of time. The other thing is I want to propose another process for this. Like I want to unlike the page before I go out. I want to check in with you a little more often before I come up with a budget like this for something we've never done before and nobody has experience in before. And that's usually what I prefer because a lot of startups, you're building things that haven't been built before and you're doing it in a way that fits your culture and not somebody else's culture. You're building a beautiful business. You're designing it, right? And so you want to create something that's fresh, that doesn't depend on everybody else's best practices, because that doesn't foster a culture of innovation. And sometimes you have to, innovation costs. There's a cost. You can't just say, we want to be innovative, but we want zero waste, zero waste innovation. Well, that's not how innovation works. Innovation is like, I'm going to go out to the sporting field and I'm going to have fun and I'm going to find out how this thing works. I'm going to take the clock apart and figure out how it works, right? It's not a closed-ended process. So this is how I've changed my mind on zero-based pricing, zero-based project budgeting. And it took me about 12 hours to change my mind.